Welcome to the course Digital Transformation and Technological Innovation. So, we are into our fourth module, that is Tech Advancement and Internet Basics. So, we are talking about some of the internet aspects. So, let's continue our discussion from where we left in the previous session. So, let's start. So, we started talking about some of the distributed computing part that will actually happen at the client side, and it typically happens via some client software, that is browser or app. So, some browser or app user interface would be used, and the main computing component at the client side is that the whole human computer interactions, right, that is handled by the distributed computing, right. So, what is the kind of human computer interaction we are talking? So, essentially first thing would be to be able to capture user inputs, right. So, for that client machines processing power would be used, and and then also for triggering external service or API request. So, the request is it would be initiated from the client side, and therefore, that processing to support or trigger the service request or API request, or and in that process capturing of user inputs, all that processing would be done at the client side. So, the client side would be covering for this part of distributed computing, right. Essentially, we also refer these kind of interactions in terms of capturing user inputs or interacting with the software for triggering some request to the service, right. That typically we refer as human computer interactions, where end users are interacting with the software and the client system, and then they all user inputs and other things are getting recorded. Now, when end users are interacting with the client machine and the client software, and then looking to trigger a request, right, they need to identify resource that they are looking for, right. So, end users identify resource on the internet. So, how they do this? Using URL. URL is Uniform Resource Locator, right. So, if you are looking for a particular web page or particular file on a computational internet across the network in the internet, then you need to know the address of that resource, or URL of that resource, uniform resource locator for that particular source in the internet, right. So, end users would be doing this part, they will be identifying the resource using the URL. So, end users need to know the URL, right, for the resource. So, URL is more like an address to the resource on the internet. So, where that resource is residing, or where that resource is stored on some computational node across the network, address to that computational node is needed, right, and within that node the path to that particular resource would also be needed. So, those components are part of URL, right. So, typically we and as end users they typically type the URLs into an internet browser, right. Now, if we want to look at the main components of URL, so it consists of multiple elements which are separated by delimiters like dot, semicolon and slash. So, there is a whole syntax to the URL format, and multiple elements are there which capture different part of the identification of the resource, and many of these elements are separated by dot and semicolon slash as appropriate as per the URL format. So, we will just look into this part as well. So, uniform resource locator, the URL will have the protocol to start with. So, first in the URL protocol would be specified, then host name, right, the machine name where this resource is actually stored, that would be there. Then where this machine is, the domain name, the domain network, where the local network of which this machine, this host is part of, right. So, that we need to know domain name, and then top level domain is also there along with the domain name. That also does another level of classification in terms of identifying the type of organization. So, the domain name will also in a way identify the organization, because organizations, they will be running their own network, and their domain name would actually give away that information in terms of a given domain name is belonging to which organization. So, domain name in a way represents the organization also, or rather organization's network, and the top level domain actually classifies the kind of network that we are talking about, the kind of domain network we are talking about, whether it is commercial, whether it is academic, or maybe any other kind of government, any other kind of classification for that organization. So, that is part of the top level domain. And then resource path. So, essentially the whole URL is about identifying that resource. Then once you have reached the machine, which network it is part of, and a few more detail about the organization that is running the network, then essentially you want to access this resource. So, the path to that resource on the host machine, that also needs to be specified. So, once that resource, to be able to locate that resource, we need this resource path, so that the client machine, the server is able to send that file back to the client machine, right. And so for that, identification of this resource is important. Now, domain name, if we come to the domain name might also be arranged into a subdomain followed by domain. So, there are lots of organizations which will be having many other departments or many functions, and those organizations with many functions, they like to keep, at times they might be, though their departments of the function might also be quite big, and therefore to be able to better manage those departments and the local network that is there, the organization might use subdomains or subdomains. So, the domain name can have a subdomain followed by the domain name, or it might be just one domain network for the whole organization, or it might be divided into multiple subdomains, and so on, right. So, domain name part covers this aspect also within the organizations, multiple local networks. Now, a top level domain, like we talked about, might include a second level classification, right. So, domain network in a way identifies the organization, because the domain name, that domain network is would be run by some organization, it will belong to some organization, right. So, that mapping would be that mapping is many times quite clearly visible, right. And the top level domain then include a second level classification in terms of what kind of organization we are talking about. Now, we can look at a URL example, and then we can do the interpretation of that URL example. So, here is an example of a URL. So, you can see it starts with the protocol. Remember, we said first protocol. So, there the protocol is HTTPS. So, this is the application transfer protocol, right, the secure version of HTTP. So, this is the protocol, and then followed by colon and 2 slashes, right. So, these are acting more like a delimiter here. So, essentially the protocol is specified first. Then you see after the delimiter we have the MySpace, which is more like host name, right. So, the second component was the host name. So, protocol that is to be followed for for that access, and then for that communication, and then the host name where the machine is. So, MySpace is the name of the server machine in its own domain network. Then after the host name there is a dot, that is delimiter, and then we have the example, that is domain name, right. So, this is the name of the example, is the name of the domain network where this host is of which this host is part of, right. And after example then again there is a dot, so that is another delimiter, and then we have com. So, com is top level domain, right. The classification of this domain name and the organization which is owning this domain name, right. So, the classification of the organization, that is associated with the example domain name is .com, that is top level domain. So, com stands for commercial, right. So, this is another way to classify the organization which is owning this domain name. So, from here what we can understand that a commercial organization is having a domain network named as example, and in that domain network this host can be reached through this domain network, right. So, this is up to this point. So, up to this point everything is case insensitive, right. So, the URL part up to this point is case insensitive, right. So, if you change this example as to you capitalize E and change domain name like this, still you will be reaching to the same node, right. But after this part the path in terms of identification of a resource, that is case sensitive. So, this part is case insensitive and this is case sensitive. So, here you see the slash and then delimiter slash and then block, that is a folder, and then this is another subfolder within the block folder, and then the file that we were looking for, entry.html. This is a HTML file that is there. So, this is the path to this resource. So, essentially we were looking for this resource, entry.html. Now, to be able to access this resource entry.html via our browser, we need to specify the full URL including the file name, right. So, again we start with the protocol, then host name, protocol to be used for communication with the server, then host name, name of that server machine, network of that or server machine or domain network of that server machine, and then type of the organization which is owning this domain network, and then the whole path to the resource, right. So, essentially interpretation of URL then becomes straightforward. So, essentially what we are asking our browser to do actually is to follow the HTTPS protocol for communication to the server that is hosting the resource, follow the HTTPS protocol, locate a host server named MySpace, right, this one. So, that locating of that host server MySpace, that is to be done in the example.com domain network, right. So, the domain network is also being specified where that host name is. So, idea is to locate a host server in that example.com domain network, and then look in the block directory and 2024 subdirectory and access the entry.html file. So, look in the block directory, so essentially the path starts, right. And so, essentially in this way we can do interpretation of a URL, right. So, you can see the protocol is specified, the name of the server machine, the host, that is specified, and the network, domain network of that host machine, that is specified, and then the path to the actual resource, the target resource, that is there. So, end user need to specify that this whole URL in the browser to be able to access that resource. So, end users identify resource on the internet using a URL, so this whole URL is needed. So, in case the URL is not known, that is where the search engines come in, right. So, search engines fill in the gap of this information asymmetry between the end users and the URL of the actual resource that they want, right. So, Google now the end users will at least know the URL of the search engine, and or they can type in the search engine and find the URL for their resource, and then from there the journey starts, right. So, essentially whether you directly know the URL and you are able to type it into the browser, or you go through search engines and you just know the URLs of search engines and you use the search engines to get back the URL that is needed for the resource. So, in this way end users start to interact with the computer and the internet browser, right. So, the whole human computer interaction is in case of internet revolves around URL, or and the then search for URL itself. If you don't as an end user, if you directly don't remember the URL. So this was about with one example of URL. Then moving forward, we'll go through some of the internet terms that are very common in our discussion in digital transformation and information systems course. And the internet terms, they are obviously distributed. We are in a distributed computing context, so these terms are applicable in that sense. So URL is uniform resource locator, as we already discussed. Host name, now we understand what do we mean by host name. So this refers to the server machine that is being looked for on the domain network, right? And then domain name, that refers to the network that is being tried for a connection, and typically it will represent an organization. So this part also we have discussed. Then next is host name and domain names, they are case sensitive. So the case insensitive. So this part also be discussed when we are here. We were talking about this whole thing is case insensitive, so which includes host name and domain names. So host name and domain names are case insensitive. That means a combination of upper and lower case letters can actually be used, right? So we can change the example, we can do we can make M as capital and then Y, then S as capital, MySpace, in this way. So that is possible. So because these are host and domain name case insensitive. Then another important aspect of identification of a resource over the internet is DNS resolution. So DNS is actually domain name system, right? So we will be talking a bit more about domain name system in coming slides. But when we specify URL, right, there needs to be a system which will actually resolve that URL, which will know which machine we are talking about, where that network is, and all that. So there are DNS servers which are part of the network, which play the role of a domain name system, and they do the DNS resolution, domain name, so they essentially they are domain name service. So the domain name that we specify, the example.com. So some system services needed to resolve that in terms of getting the actual IP address for that domain network. So this domain network maps to which IP address. So that that resolution is done by domain name systems. And coming back to the domain names, so DNS servers will actually treat as I said, examples all capitals.com and example.com all lower cases, and then this mixed of upper and lower cases, all these would be treated identically by the DNS servers, right. So therefore that part becomes case insensitive. Now domains may have lots of different hosts also, right. So we talked about one host, that was MySpace. Now an organization might run multiple hosts for different websites or different services that they are running. So to give you an example, Google search engine website host name is www. If you recall what you type in a web browser or internet browser, you type www.google.com, right. So that www is the host name, the server machine name for Google search engine. But as we know that for other websites of Google, host names are different actually. For example, calendar.google.com and drive.google.com. So all of us are very regular users of Google Drive. So you can check the host name for that particular service. So host name will be Drive, and the host name for the search engine is www, which is sort of default host name for websites being run by most organizations, right. So when organizations are running multiple services, sometimes they might want to change the host name. So which is the case with the Google, as I said, calendar.google.com and drive.google.com. Now resource path, as we talked about, resource path refers to the path that maps the resource to a folder location where the target file that we want that is stored on the server machine. So the full path to that target file, that is to be specified in the resource path. So that mapping is done by the resource path, right, for the target file. And obviously the target file will have its own file name, so that refers to the target file in the path location. So that those are all the elements of an URL. Now if we come to the path and file names, so as we said that path and file names are these are case sensitive, right. So path and file names are case sensitive. So but the actual behavior here is slightly different. Actual behavior depends on the hosting environment, because essentially these files are stored in some machine, and that machine is running some environment which might be having a Linux operating system or Unix operating system or Windows operating system. Now these operating systems themselves have slightly different behavior in terms of folder and file naming, and therefore the actual behavior when we are trying to locate the same file residing in a Linux machine or Unix machine or Windows machine, and when we specify URL, so that behavior, how it will get mapped to the actual folder names, actual file names on the machine. So it depends on the hosting environment. So for example, Linux and Unix they are case sensitive, right. So therefore the path and file name, if with the same name, because this is case sensitive. So if you slightly change just to uppercasing of one of the letter in the file name, then a different files would be, so it would be understood as different files in case of Linux or Unix environment at the server side. But Windows is case insensitive. So in case of Windows, even if you just uppercase one of the letter in the file name or the folder name, you will reach the same resource. So therefore it depends some of this behavior depends on the hosting environment as well. Now because of this, because the internet, as we talked about, is essentially a heterogeneous it is a network of it's a heterogeneous network and connects machines running different kind of hardwares, different kind of operating system and other applications, right. So that part is clearly visible when we talk about the actual behavior in case of path and file name, right. Now it also affects, because of this change, it also affects the search engine and SEO, because what is the job of a search engine? You are looking for a resource, you type in your keywords in the search engine. Now if depending on where that resource is, what kind of environment is there for that resource, and therefore this case sensitive and case insensitive both scenario will play out, and the search engine will might give different give two results depending on if you change the name, right. So affect search engine, and SEO, search engine optimization, is also affected, because just because you uppercased one of the letter in a particular file, a search engine optimization might not might do some sort of duplication there, right, and same goes for the search engine. So this whole path and file naming things have a impact on search engine and SEO. Then what are the best practices that firms have adopted? So some of this discussion that we just did, it is actually resolved through best practices. So what most organizations do, they default to lowercase, and also they take advantage of automatic redirect. So for other variants of because of this case sensitivity issue with connected to the environment, automatic redirects can actually solve this issue, right. So these best practices in terms of lower casing and automatic redirect can actually address this issue. So in practice, we do not actually face much of issue because of these kind of practices. Now moving on, first component of a URL was actually protocol. So in this internet context, when we say protocol, what essentially we means essentially communication is an important part of network, because different computational nodes, they need to they need to they communicate to be able to complete the computing, to be able to process the workload, right. So the protocol are essentially more about enabling communication. So protocol enables communication by defining the format of data and rules for exchange, right. So in internet context and internet protocol, there are lots of them. They would essentially be about communication and how the data format is going to be and how the exchange of that data will actually happen. So all those things are actually defined by the protocol, right. Now there are lots of protocols that are there in internet. So let us take few examples. HTTP, so this is hypertext transfer protocol. So what is the role of this hypertext transfer protocol, HTTP? If you recall that the URL that we have used, that was actually a version of HTTPS, secure version of HTTP. So this was the protocol that we were talking about in our URL example. So HTTP protocol, this is a hypertext transfer protocol, and essentially hypermedia files, which can be considered internet version of text files in a way. These are more like internet versions of text files. So HTTP is actually used to transfer these kind of files, clients, to allow access to these kind of files by the end users. Then SMTP is there. So SMTP is simple mail transfer protocol. So this simple mail transfer protocol is actually about sending emails, right, sending emails, so that this protocol enables electronic communication over the internet, right. So one end user sitting on a client machine would be able to send an email and send email to the server via SMTP, right. So the email communication is facilitated via SMTP. Now another protocol is FTP. FTP is file transfer protocol. So that is for transfer of computer files. We want to access files on a remote computer, then FTP is the protocol that can allow us to access a remote computer via the network, via the internet, right. So HTTP for hypermedia files, SMTP for emails, and FTP for computer files. So these are the different protocols that are used in internet for different kind of services. Now what we will do, we will discuss them one by one. So let us start with the HTTP, that is hypertext transfer protocol. So this is an application layer network protocol, right. So this is a network protocol because internet is a network. So essentially we are in the internet context, we are in the distributed computing context. So this is a network protocol and works at the application level. So it is an application layer network protocol, and the role is to transmit hypermedia documents such as HTML across the web, right. So what this protocol does, it defines universal rules and formatting standards that allow web browsers, clients and web servers to communicate with each other. So communication is facilitated through the rules defined by this protocol and the formatting standards for the data defined by this protocol. Now we will look at some of the defining characteristics or attributes of or key features of this protocol HTTP. So one is it follows client server model, right. So client server model we have already talked about. So this is more asymmetric approach. So always initiated by the client. So this we have already talked about, and so HTTP follows that particular architecture, client server architecture, right. Web server sends web browser sends a request from the client side, from the end user side, and the target server returns a response containing the requested resources. So, some target resource is needed at the client side, and through HTTP that request goes via the web browser, and then the server would be returning that resource, would be giving that response containing the requested resources, right. Now, another feature of this HTTP protocol is that it is a stateless protocol. That means every HTTP request is executed independently. That means if you go to the browser and you open yahoo.com in one tab and then go open another tab and again open yahoo.com. So, these two instances of yahoo.com would actually be independent, right, because you will be following HTTP protocol or some HTTPS version of it, right. So, every HTTP request will be actually executed independently. That is why we are able to open multiple tabs for the same URL for the same website, right. So, this is a stateless protocol. The server does not retain any memory or session state. So, there is no session that is managed by this protocol. So, there is does not retain any memory or session state from previous interactions. So, you open a website google.com, do some searching, or open a u.com, do some searching for the videos, and then once you close those tabs and reopen the tabs, you will be getting a fresh session. So, it will have no connection to the previous interaction that you have had, right. Obviously, you can get URLs of those previous interaction from the history that is there in the browser, but directly from the same browser, if you open a new tab and again you retype, you will be getting a fresh session. So, there is no connection with the previous session because the HTTP protocol does not retain any session states. But there are lots of websites which provide the kind of services where you have to log in and your page is actually customized, configured, right. So, they need to maintain a state to be able to do that. So, that next time when you log into the same website, you should be able to reach your page and your details there, right. So, some sort of a statefulness is needed for those websites. So, how that is achieved? So, one is to have an account, user ID password kind of account, and then the server will be able to identify the user via that user ID and password settings. So, that so one thing is via the login details, but there are many websites where people will not be opening accounts, and in those cases statefulness can still be simulated via HTTP cookies. So, cookie mechanism is there. So, these are small tiny text files that are stored in the client machine, and whenever you open a website, that website will have access to the cookies stored by the server on your machine, client machine. So, so that so those cookies are then can be used to manage the state, right. So, it will be used to identify the user, and therefore statefulness can be simulated. So, by default the protocol is stateless, but then it can be simulated by via HTTP cookies. So, so let us stop at this point, and we will continue our discussion on HTTP in the next session. Thank you.